Hi everyone, welcome to another wonderful day of Ottoman history, and we are going to be speaking about imperial expansion under the reign of Suleiman. Now, you might know of Sultan Suleiman. He might be the only Sultan or Ottoman Sultan you've heard of. If you're not very familiar with Ottoman history, if you haven't heard of him, that's also fine. He is generally considered the most famous Sultan, both in European sources and in Ottoman sources. Partially it's because he reigned a long time, right? So if you look at his regnal years, 1520 to 1566, what you see is that he was around for 46 years, which is quite a long time to rule an empire. In fact, his dad before him, Sultan Selim, was only around for 8 years, and so therefore he was able to leave a much longer mark. But more importantly, as we'll get into later, he is often known as Suleiman the Magnificent, or Kanuni in Turkish, meaning lawgiver, because he is often identified with this sort of classical order, what is often remembered as the high point, even though it really wasn't, but the high point of the Ottoman Empire. And because of that, he is often associated with its highest achievements, because he creates a sort of canon of Ottoman thought and art and accomplishment that everything else is then measured against. But we're going to be looking at something more specific here, which is military campaigns. How did he actually just expand the empire? And more particularly, how did those expansions now turn into more than just military campaigns locally, but into a sort of set of world wars against a variety of competitors across Eurasia? Now, just to give you an overview, remember what we were talking about before. It's under his father, Sultan Selim, 1512 to 1520. The Ottoman Empire basically conquers the Arab lands, doubles its space, its size, and also doubles or triples its income, so giving a massive amount of extra tax revenue to the Ottoman state, which is then funnels it back into armies which are then sent out on a variety of campaigns under the reign of Sultan Suleyman. I'm just going to go over a few of these, but the first thing he does kind of once he takes power is go over to Rhodes, that island over here, and conquer it, taking it over from a bunch of knights hospitaliers, which were kind of pirates preying on traffic in the Mediterranean, taking everyone and forcing them to pay ransom. Takes it over, sets up an Ottoman stronghold there that lasts for another 400 years, and then turns his sights towards Hungary, takes over Hungary, has some failed sieges of Vienna, eventually conquers Budapest and elsewhere, then turns towards North Africa, which was being taken over by the Habsburgs, especially Tunis, turns North Africa to a set of vassal states, then turns his attention to the Ottomans turn their attention to Iraq and the Caucasus. They fight in Bitlis, which is in Georgia, Tabriz in northern Iran, and then Baghdad, eventually moving into the Persian Gulf and then back into Hungary. So it was a long 46 years of constant different military campaigns. Not that he was personally leading all of them, but he was often present, and in fact, apparently he died while on campaign in Buda. And they discovered recently a sort of tomb that was built on the frontier for him in the Hungarian countryside. But for 1526, he expands the empire. He gets all the way to defeats the Hungarians. One of these things that happens is that basically through good strategy, they funnel the Hungarian cavalry, which are basically medieval knights, into a valley in which they line them up in front of their cannons and mow them down. And you can actually see this in Ottoman depictions of the battle, of the cannons, and then the dead knights here. Also here, knights being chased by Ottoman cavalry and the cannons shooting off at into the distance. Eventually, the Ottomans will take over both also Budapest, that is Buda and Pest, the two cities on the other side of the river, and create a province of Ottoman Hungary that will last for about 150 years. And their great competitor in this period and there, which is the Habsburg Emperor. The Habsburgs were a large empire slash dynasty centered in Vienna, but so controlling kind of what's today parts of Germany and Central Europe, but also Spain and Portugal and the Netherlands, and with that, of course, parts of the Americas, etc. But we can also see they also had the Kingdom of Naples and Sardinia and Sicily here, and with that, some attempts to take over the North African coast. Now, the head of the Habsburgs at that time, a man named Charles V, had a very similar, almost synchronous timing with Suleiman. They both came to power around the same time, at the same age, as young men. They end up lasting, having very long reigns of over 40 years, and then basically becoming lifelong competitors, also eventually retiring from public life in the same way. He goes off to, he abdicates, goes into a monastery at a certain point. And what you have is actually a very weird mirrored life. And for most of their lives, they were competing each other to be kind of imperial world conquerors, the possible final world conqueror, the one who would bring all of the world under one rule and therefore signal the end of times. And in fact, there was a very strong apocalyptic aspect to their competition. But what this really meant is that they were fighting a world war on multiple fronts. They were fighting in the Mediterranean, in Tunis, in naval battles. They were fighting in Hungary and across multiple different parts at the same time. And as we'll see, also across into the Indian Ocean, as Portugal was part of the Habsburg Empire as well. Now, this led to some interesting alliances, such as when the French and the Allies decided to create a connection. As we see, this was set off because the Habsburgs dominated the French, captured France, the French King Francis I at the Battle of Pavia. Pavia is a city outside of Milan today, which led them to look for new allies. And the French found that in the Ottomans, who were the perennial fighters of the Habsburgs, and who actually also were sticking their fingers into many different European power struggles. The Ottomans also were trying to encourage the Protestant revolutionaries in Central Europe. But for the most part, they actually had this very strong alliance with the French. They gave the French most favored nation status, which basically gave them trading privileges. And in return, the French and the Ottomans worked together militarily. The Ottoman Navy even wintered in French ports in southern France during this period. And one of the key figures in the Ottoman Navy at this time is a man named Barbarossa, which you can see here depicted in this European painting of him. I'm not sure if that's what he really looked like, but he was an immensely important and naval figure. He was essentially a privateer slash pirate. A privateer is basically someone who raids pirates with official enemy ships, with official recognition of the state. He and his brother both were pirates, and he followed his older brother into that trade, and basically used that as a launch pad to lead successful military and naval battles against different opponents, until he was basically co-opted by the Ottoman state and turned into an admiral and tapped to lead the Ottoman fleets to great success. Not only did he essentially lift the siege of Tunis and eject the Habsburgs from Tunis, turning North Africa into a Ottoman vassalship for the next 400 years, but he also massively defeated the Holy League and their combined navies. The Holy League is basically the Habsburgs, the Papal States, the Italian states, maybe the Netherlands groups, etc. A variety of different people who basically formed a joint naval fleet that far outnumbered the Ottoman fleet, but Hayreddin Barbarossa, or Redbeard as he's called, quickly took over and basically managed to defeat this very large navy, securing Ottoman domination of the Mediterranean for the next few decades. Later on, by the way, in the 1571, there would be the famous Battle of Lepanto, another major naval battle in the Adriatic Sea between Greece and Italy, that basically actually resulted in the Ottomans defeated by the Holy League. Now, this time around, this defeat didn't actually change very much in the balance of power, because the Ottomans rebuilt their navy very quickly, actually within 6 months. But it was a good boost of morale for European forces, who now felt that allied they could actually turn back this menace which seemed that could not be stopped, which is the Ottoman armies. And in fact, you can actually go to churches throughout Italy today and actually see the Battle of Lepanto depicted and commemorated in different ways, such as this one, which is on Adriatic City, and I think Rottamare, where you can see the Ottoman flags against the flag of the Holy Leagues, so the four crescents versus the crucified Jesus. Often Ottoman flags were taken as trophies and then put into churches and turned into sites of pilgrimage, etc. So this was a major battle, at least for Europeans, as a sort of turning point of Ottoman power. But in any case, in the Battle of Lepanto, one of the things I want to point out is that if you look at how these navies are fighting, they are all basically galley ships, right? The Mediterranean doesn't have the best winds. It's easier to get around in galley ships. And this is apparently one of the last major naval battle in which galley ships were being used, that is, ships rowed by slaves or galley slaves who are manning the oars rather than sails. As you can see, they also have sails when they need it. The problem is, if you want to have more maneuverability, etc., you basically need to have oars, especially in the Mediterranean. Now, the Habsburgs formed the competitors to the east of the Ottomans, and probably the largest source of competition for Sultan Suleyman. But there were other competitors to the south. There are two major empires here that we're talking about. The first is this one, the Safavids, the perennial enemies of the Ottomans, now under another figure called Shah Tahmasp at that time. And the Ottomans went back and forth fighting this area. They basically, during Sultan Suleiman, conquered the Caucasus, so what's today kind of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. And they also went in and took over Iraq, basically turning Baghdad and northern Iraq into an Ottoman zone for the next few hundred years. Though the Safavids would routinely come in and conquer or raid it in different times. The other major empire to be mentioned is this one in the green, which is the Mughals, which started to basically control North India and then later on the Central and South India. And it's there that they formed probably the largest and most populous empire at that time. They never formally were enemies of the Ottomans. They were kind of too far to really compete with each other, but they did send embassies to each other and recognize each other as sort of equals and competitors at large. One of the interesting things at that time is that is the idea that you could actually conquer the whole world. If you remember, the globe had been circumnavigated by Magellan in 1498, and now that it was seen as a finite space, like they already knew it was round, but they didn't know how big it was and where it was going to end and what was in it. Once they understood that actually the world is finite, that you can go around it and it can be controlled, there was an idea that one emperor, whether that was going to be Charles V or Sultan Suleiman or possibly an emperor like the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, pictured here, could control it. And in fact, if you look at Mughal paintings or Habsburg paintings, less so Ottoman ones, there is this idea, you do see the globe propping up in many different places as a space that can be controlled, as in these pictures of Jahangir shooting arrows or at his enemies or hugging his friends. In this case, the Safavid Shah hugging him. He's shooting an arrow at the I believe the the African ruler of Ahmednagar, who was the head of a Deccan state in central India. Speaking of circumnavigating the globe, one of the new other types of competitors to the Ottomans was the Portuguese Empire. Now, when we say empire, they're not a land empire like the Mughals or the Ottomans or the Habsburgs, but they're essentially a seaborne empire. They basically have forts and factories, by factories mean trading posts, all across the Indian Ocean and parts of East Africa, but mostly in the Indian Ocean, all the way from Nagasaki and Macau here to essentially the Indian subcontinent littoral and the East African littoral here. Now, since the 1480s or so, the Portuguese had entered into the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and then set about creating a protection racket in what was once a free trade zone. So they set about forcing people to pay them protection money in order to trade, and if they didn't, they would basically sink their ships. This led to a variety of Ottoman encounters with the Portuguese. After all, the Portuguese had originally, or at least the Ottomans, had taken over Mamluk lands in Egypt, in Mecca, and the Hejaz, because they said that the Mamluks weren't protecting these areas from Portuguese incursion. And the Portuguese actually attacked Jeddah here, which is right next to Mecca. It's the main port of Mecca. And so the idea that the holy sanctuaries of Islam were now under threat by an infidel Christian power was enough to create new navies. And so the Ottomans actually started engaging in a set of naval battles, not just in the Mediterranean, but also in the Indian Ocean, specifically in the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and around the coast of Yemen. And you can see here in these depictions of both Ottoman depictions on the left, on the right, European depictions, basically the galleys of the Ottomans quickly surrounding and destroying the sailing ships of the Portuguese. And so the Ottomans were basically able to push back the Portuguese from the Red Sea in the port and the Persian Gulf, but basically came to a standstill there. You can actually see in different spaces in which they basically now created new beachheads, spaces of control over the East African coast, including this place called Massawa. Basically, that was the land of Eritrea, and then also it pushed them into Yemen to try to control Yemen. This didn't last very long, basically just for a few decades in the 16th century, but it did put them a foothold. And in fact, there was a mufti, or a jurist of a position of the jurist of Massawa, officially until the 1800s, even though the Ottomans never actually sent anyone there by that point. In this map, you can see the battles that the Ottomans engaged with in the 1530s and 40s under the direction of Sultan Suleyman Pasha, the Grand Vizier, who was pushing for confronting the Portuguese in this area. So they were basically fighting across the coast of Yemen and Oman, but also in different parts of East Africa as well, and on occasion in parts of deeper into the Indian Ocean. But these are really, these further ones are not major battles, right? They're relatively small engagements. One of the things that they would do, though, ultimately, even though they weren't able to extend their naval power much further than the northern part of the Indian Ocean, is that they did engage with basically aid and soft power initiatives to various groups across the Indian Ocean. So you apparently had the khutbah, or the Friday prayer, one of the classic signs of sovereignty, read out in the Ottoman Sultan's name in places like Aceh and Ceylon and the Maldives. Aceh, of course, was one of the central spaces of fighting against the Portuguese. The Acehnese actually, their Sultanate of Aceh was one of the fiercest resistors of Portuguese and Dutch incursions in this period, and so actually asked the Ottomans for artillery, essentially, to fight the Portuguese with, and the one or two shipments were apparently sent. One of the things you'll notice here, though, is that the Ottomans, so while they're able to kind of engage with the broader Indian Ocean world, which is amazing. They're not really able to extend control very far. Why is that? Partially, it just has to do with where are they going to create ships. There's no timber in these areas. These are all desert areas. Timber at this point, there's no timber in Egypt either. So to create ships, you basically had to cut down trees in Anatolia, in Syria, ship them overland or overseas, carry them across the land part to the Red Sea, from Suez to Suez, and then basically construct ships in the Red Sea. This was very difficult and basically limited the type of navies that could be created. Also, of course, the Ottoman ships at the time were galley-based rather than sailing. So while this worked well for controlling the Mediterranean and parts of inner seas in the northern Indian Ocean, probably didn't work so well for going further out, where the Portuguese were. One of the questions, of course, is why did the Ottomans not go to the Americas? This is a classic question, not just for Ottoman, but also, for example, Chinese historians. The idea is that if another civilization or another nation had gone out to the Americas, they would have discovered it, and therefore progressed scientifically, been able to create more, have more power, colonies, etc. One, I would say two things to this regard. The idea is, one is basically revenues. There was actually much more revenues in taking over places like Egypt than there could ever be, at least initially, from the Americas, even after eventually silver and gold deposits were discovered in large parts of the Americas. But still, it was much easier and possible to basically control Egypt, which was a much richer prize than some of these places in the Americas initially, at least in the early 1500s. Two is that the Ottomans did know that what was happening in the Americas. They obviously seem to have read European sources, even if they didn't send anyone out there, because they created at least one book about the Americas called the Tarikh Hindi Garbi, the history of the West Indies, in which they actually depicted kind of scenes of European conquistador type explorers engaging with the different marvels in there, including, for example, a depiction of a Mexican temple, which seems to almost have a cross now put onto it, and a depiction of cactuses like nopal in there. So they didn't know about it, but they just simply weren't that interested in it. And I think also the position, that is, being at the eastern part of the Mediterranean, having to pass the Straits of Gibraltar and then create another navy with a different sailing technology to go to another part of the world, just probably wasn't going to happen. The Indian Ocean was easier, but even that was difficult to project military power into. One of the interesting things that you can think about is that Ottoman expansion militarily basically has a physical limit to it. If you were to create a circle with the radius in the center in Istanbul and a radius of about 1,000 kilometers, 1,000 miles, you could basically draw the entire Ottoman Empire. It extends all the way to Buda, goes basically to Tunis, then to parts of Egypt, and then kind of into the Caucasus. And why is that? Because that's as far as they can basically move an army in one campaign season until the snows of winter start. So when they're campaigning against Vienna, they're trying to take it over. They arrive in Vienna in August. They lay siege to the city for a month or two, but then they have to turn back because it starts to snow. They can't keep the siege up, and they can never fully take over the city in time as you would in a normal sense. Last but not least, there is a competitor emerging to the north of the Ottomans, and that is Muscovy. The Empire of Muscovy centered initially in the lands of Kievan Rus and elsewhere, but at this point in the 1500s, 1600s, quickly expanding, becoming another major competitor eventually, especially in the 1700s, to the Ottomans. But at this point, interestingly enough, often dressing in a fashion that is very legible to Ottoman or Safavid envoys. In fact, they basically are using the same type of thrones, they're using the same type of formal dress, etc., as other Eurasian powers. And in fact, one of the interesting things is this throne you can go see in the Kremlin Museum today, which was gifted by a very rich Armenian merchant in the Russian Empire, based off of Persian and Ottoman ideals. to the Russian Tsar. Anyways, think about it. Think about world wars of engaged by the Ottoman empires and many others as they tried to now conquer the world, as this even that idea was present at that time.